Good morning, everyone. I'm Dolly Duffy, the Executive Director of your Notre Dame Alumni Association, and welcome to our first session of Notre Dame Perspectives. We're thrilled to welcome you today, and we have here at Reunion from the youngest who's here from the class of 2018, and I just happened to be walking down the street and I ran into Ron Wong, who was wearing a hat that says 70-year reunion. He said, "Dolly, I made it." So today's event is one of our really signature reunion events where we discuss the biggest and most thought-provoking issues of the day. And I'm particularly excited about today's topic and the lineup of speakers. The theme is Pathways to Peace, Catholic Peacebuilding Around the World. Today, we'll spend time together to explore what it takes to achieve peace in a world that we all know is so fraught with conflict, violence, and suffering. We're going to examine peacemaking and peacebuilding through a Catholic lens, something that's incredibly important here at Notre Dame. And so now I'm delighted to introduce our moderator and my friend, Notre Dame colleague, Laura McAleer, the Associate Vice President for Federal and Washington Relations. That's a mouthful. She's a proud member of the class of 1998, which is celebrating their reunion this year, and so we're pleased to have her experience here this morning. In her current role, Laura is a bridge builder between Notre Dame scholars and policymakers. Her federal government experience includes impressive service to the Department of Defense, leading strategic engagement with the U.S. Congress, and in addition to advising 4 senators, she brings 20-plus years of civilian and military experience to her current work. And just as an aside, I also want to add, she is a person that always goes to yes. She's an incredible partner, and we're so thrilled to have her today. So we have a really great lineup. Laura, it's all yours.
Thank you, Dolly, and good morning, everyone. It is an honor to be here as we kick off our reunion weekend. I couldn't think of a more special way to kick off my own 25th reunion celebration, and also a special thanks to Dolly and Sharon Keene and the incredible Alumni Association team for making this session happen as well as the entire weekend. And thank you to all of you for joining us this morning. Today's discussion, in addition to being part of the signature ND Perspectives series, is the culminating event of this year's Notre Dame Forum on War and Peace. For those not familiar with the Forum, the series was first established in 2005 with the goal of inspiring and encouraging campus-wide dialogue and discernment throughout a given academic year on a theme of great importance to the university, the nation, and the world. This past year's Forum has contemplated war and peace, guided by Pope Francis's words from Against War, Building a Culture of Peace, and our shared responsibility to build a world that is more peaceful because it is more just. As the final event in this year's Forum, as we celebrate coming together as a Notre Dame family for Reunion Weekend, today's conversation uniquely convenes Notre Dame practitioner voices, bringing together Notre Dame scholars, alums, and leaders who have dedicated careers and service to the direct advancement of peace and security. 2 of our distinguished panelists are Notre Dame faculty members, recognized thought leaders who are meaningfully engaged in the scholarship of international security. They are also beloved teaching professors, well-known and sought-after instructors who uniquely bring real-life experiences and learning to their classroom environments, serving on the front lines of developing and educating our Notre Dame students, who are going to be the decision makers, public servants, and leaders of tomorrow. Our other 2 panelists are Notre Dame graduates, alums who took their Notre Dame education and after leaving campus dedicated a quarter of a century as public servants in the national security realm. They have served as committed practitioners and boots on the ground in conflict-affected areas around the globe. One, a decorated diplomat with the Department of State, who has served in multiple countries around the world in times of peace as well as times of conflict. And the other, a career Army officer and graduate of Notre Dame, storied ROTC program, who has returned to campus to lead the university's military and veterans affairs outreach and helping to continue to shape and educate tomorrow's public servants. Together, these distinguished panelists will share their personal perspectives on pathways to peace and help us consider how peacemaking and peace building, viewed through the Catholic lens, can guide us through the tumultuous challenges ahead. As part of this conversation, we will begin by examining what we mean by Catholic peacekeeping, seeking to build a shared theoretical understanding of Catholic social teaching on war and peace and how it aligns with international law. We will then explore this teaching in action, looking to peacekeeping and peacebuilding in practice and at work in pre-conflict, conflict, and post-conflict areas, considering ways Catholic teaching can help guide approaches in these areas, as well as the impact of this teaching and a Notre Dame education on service in these areas. And finally, we will conclude with our collective call to action, examining the whole of society teamwork required to overcome conflict in all corners of the world. Our goal is that we leave here this morning with a deeper understanding of Catholic teaching on peacekeeping and a renewed shared commitment to advancing peace. I'd now like to invite our distinguished guests to join us on the stage to discuss these important topics. First, Dr. Michael Desch, the Packey J.D. Professor of International Relations, and Brian and Janelle Brady, Family Director of the Notre Dame International Security Center. Welcome, Mike. Ken Heckel, Director of Notre Dame's Office of Military and Veterans Affairs, retired Army officer and Notre Dame class of 1996. Welcome, Ken. And Dr. Amelia Justina Powell, Notre Dame Professor of Political Science and concurrent Professor of Law, an expert on international law and peaceful conflict resolution. Welcome. And finally, Mark Rincon, a career Foreign Service officer and current Deputy Executive Director at the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, and notably a fellow graduate of Notre Dame's very finest class of 1998. Sit on down. All right, well, let's see if the mic is working. I'm not sure it is, but. Welcome all, this is a great panel. I'm excited to chat with you all this morning. Thanks for making the time to start off Reunion Weekend with us. For me personally, this is such a wonderful intersection of my personal passions and career path, bringing together my own 20 years of service in the national security realm with my current role at Notre Dame, helping to connect our thought leaders and scholars on campus with policymakers and practitioners in DC. And like so many in this auditorium this morning, I am very proud of the ethos of service and morality universally shared by the university's alums, faculty, and staff. So Mike, I'd like to start with you, ask you to help us frame the conversation for us this morning. As director of Notre Dame's International Security Center, you really sit at the crossroads of academic thought on these topics. From your perspective in theory and in study, what do we mean by Catholic peacekeeping, and what distinguishes Catholic peacekeeping from other approaches?
Well, that's a huge set of questions, and being a college professor, I'm normally a man of few words, and not capable of answering something like that in less than 45 minutes. But I'll give you the sound bites. I mean, I think that from the perspective particularly of a faculty member at the University of Notre Dame, the nation's and world's premier Roman Catholic intellectual institution. I think the core of how we think about issues of war and peace, the pole star is the Catholic just war tradition. And that's not only, I think, a pole star for those of us who are Roman Catholic, but I think a lot of modern thinking about the just war tradition even among people who aren't Catholic or even particularly religious, goes back to some of the seminal work done by St. Augustine and especially St. Thomas Aquinas. And so when we think about issues of war and peace, and particularly how we should think about peace building, we really begin, I think, with the just war theorizing.
Fantastic. That's a great start to the conversation. And now, Amelia, I'd like to turn to you. You extensively work on international law and peaceful resolution of conflict. Can you tell us how Catholic teaching aligns with international law?
So international law really offers countries a multitude of methods that they can use for dispute resolution. And they range from simple methods like bilateral negotiations and go all the way through mediation to international courts. And I want to recall the words of John Paul II, who in his thought and his beliefs often spoke about international law. He thought that international law, honest diplomacy, mutual understanding, things like communication between states are really something that can help us resolve conflicts. And then I want to draw our attention to the words of Maximilian Kolbe, who perished in Auschwitz. In one of his letters to his younger brother before being in Auschwitz, he said, you know, the world is really hurt by an unbelievable epidemic of indifference. And I think that international law can help us deal with that indifference.
Thank you. And now I'm going to turn to our two practitioners, to Mark and to Ken. As graduates of this university and career public servants, for both of you, 4 to 5 years after graduating from here, the U.S. was attacked on 9/11. You were called to service aiming toward peace in several locations throughout the world. Can you share with us this morning how your Notre Dame education, and Catholic teaching specifically, has shaped and influenced your careers? And also speak to if there were any points where the Catholic teaching presented conflicts or challenges or created any tensions between your identities as Catholics as well as government public servants.
I can take it first. I think in my experience, in a way, I embody the experience of a student who had the world come to Notre Dame and took Notre Dame to the world. And by that I mean I had the privilege of participating in not one but 2 study abroad programs. And I think it's that experiential learning, the ability to take the theory that we learned about in the lectures and the classes here, and then to see it in real life. The first program I went to was Angers, so it was an eye-opening experience that in a way transformed me. But it was really the second program in Jerusalem, of all places, that took it to another level, because we saw it on the ground. The situation, I was regularly challenged as a student, both by Israelis and Palestinians, about flaws in U.S. policy, flaws in U.S. diplomacy. And it really kind of encouraged me to learn more about what is our policy. If I'm going to be challenged about it, if I'm going to be seen unintentionally as a diplomat representing not only the university but the United States, there's an imperative to learn about that. And so I think the university's program is grounded in a certain morality, a certain ethic to go out and to serve. And that's what inspired me to join the Foreign Service. Incidentally, my first day at the State Department was September 10th, 2001. So the first day was getting badges and kind of doing the usual HR things, but the second day was quite a day. And I think from there, it kind of solidified the thought of going out to serve. And so the connection, I think, with the Catholic tradition is, as was mentioned before, the ideas of just war need to prevail. But I think Tantour and the experience in Jerusalem taught me about ecumenical studies. That is, religion has a lot of different facets to it, and that what we can take from it is what unites us rather than what divides us. So I found that to be a very interesting and helpful perspective.
Again, what about you?
Thanks, Laura. So for me, growing up as a Catholic kid and coming to Notre Dame, with the Catholic education and my experience here at Notre Dame, particularly the Army ROTC program, helped define and refine for me was my concept of servant leadership. And so I think about, in all the units that I had the privilege to serve in, to be led by soldiers, to lead soldiers, for me, the constant framework for me was always about that model of servant leadership, which is provided to us by many, perhaps most importantly, Jesus, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, Father Ted. Wonderful examples of servant leadership that I took as an inspiration for the way that I engaged in leading soldiers, in mentoring, coaching, counseling, developing them and their families, whether it was in a stateside assignment, whether it was overseas, whether it was in a combat environment, deployed. I just constantly have in my mind, and I think in my heart, this framework of servant leadership to be of service to others. And I think that's, the Catholic teaching and the Catholic upbringing kind of reinforces that.
Thank you, Ken. That servant leadership ethos, I think, is something that we all share as alums, as staff, as faculty of this university, and we all share that common call to serve others and be a force for good. So I'd like to continue next, just digging into that a little bit more, particularly the student formation piece. Notre Dame education aims to form the whole person, cultivating both technical proficiencies and an ethical, moral, and spiritual integrity that really lasts a lifetime. And Ken, I'm going to continue with you here as an alum who spent 2 decades of service in the military, as you just shared, returned to Notre Dame first in university relations, now as the director of Notre Dame's Office of Military and Veterans Affairs. You really sit at the nexus of God, country, and Notre Dame in your role. And I know you are still very new to that impactful role, but if you would share with us a little bit this morning, a bit about your office, as well as how it advances Notre Dame's missions as a force for good, particularly among the formation of our military-connected students.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So I'm super excited to be part of the Office of Military and Veterans Affairs. What place other than Notre Dame should be kind of the premier model of what it means to be inclusive and understanding of those who aspire to serve, those who are currently serving, and those who have served. So our mission in the Office of Military and Veterans Affairs is to elevate this ethos of servant leadership that I've already kind of mentioned a little bit by creating an engaged military-connected community here on campus and abroad throughout the entire Notre Dame family. So we do this in a lot of different ways, speaking specifically about our students, and there are several types of students that we think about in this military-connected community. We have our wonderful students in the ROTC programs who are aspiring to serve in the military. We have our heroes who are returning from military service that are here as student veterans and are using the Notre Dame experience as a bridge to the next phase of their life. We have quite a few active duty students here, many of whom work with Mike and his folks in the International Security Center who are studying in their master's degree level and the PhD level, so those are currently serving military-connected students. And then we have what I anticipate will be a growing number of military-connected students, and those are dependents of veterans who have served. So those, in many ways, are students that we want to include in kind of this understanding of our military-connected student community. They've kind of grown up a little bit different than maybe the typical student has, been moving around with mom and dad in the service. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about what their Notre Dame experience is like. So with these military-connected students, we really want to take a holistic but also a targeted look at the types of programs, services, support that we're providing to them while they're here as students. And we focus on things like student access and student success and what their student community and life are like, and making sure that we have the right support programs around them so that they can excel. We also obviously want to aspire to be exceptional in undergraduate, graduate, and professional education programs and research. So we look at what our military-connected students are doing and ensure that they are contributing part of that academic life and that research life as well. And then the third thing is really taking a look at how we engage outside of campus. So what type of work are we doing with other institutions that have these types of organizations? How are they supporting their military-connected students? Are there opportunities for us to partner with them? And then, other military and veteran service type organizations that help bring students here to this campus, to help prepare them for life after graduation, our government agency partners in DC and beyond, as well as how we think about welcoming our Notre Dame network of alumni, parents, and friends into supporting our military-connected students.
It's wonderful.
That's it.
Yeah, thank you. And it's hard to believe, but Ken is actually a team of 2 for accomplishing all of that. And his predecessor, Reagan Jones, who's been a fantastic partner over the years. And I know Ken's going to be taking this program to even new heights, but we just are grateful for your leadership because I think it's so important to our mission. And now turning to our professors, to Professor Desch and Professor Powell, you both, as I mentioned, are really beloved educators with a strong following of Notre Dame students, building a sense of purpose and mission in your students, with many of your students going on to serve humanity in the international security realm. So tell us a bit about your approaches to educating students in your classes, particularly the way you foster learning environments where students cultivate a strong ethical and moral lens. And I'll let you decide who wants to go first out of the...
Ladies first.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So I've been in Notre Dame, I think 11 years now. And I would say that the highlight of being a professor here for me is leading the International Law and Holocaust Study abroad in Poland. I've done it, I think, 8 or 9 times by now, where my husband and I, we take 16, 14 students from Notre Dame to the country of my birth, Poland. And when you think about the title of the course, International Law and Holocaust, you probably know what those students are going to do. We go to concentration camps and work camps. So to Auschwitz, to Stutthof concentration camp. We visit places that are not happy. For me in particular, because I was born in Poland. And I think I see the biggest change in students who have gone onto that program and listened to the trees that were there when Auschwitz was in operation, and walked on the ground where prisoners were walking, and going through the very tight and really stuffy hallway where Saint Maximilian Kolbe perished in a starvation cell. This is what I think is the heart of Notre Dame experience. It's developing narrative empathy, writing stories in your own head about what it means to be a policymaker, what it means to be a human that makes good decisions, not only for yourself, but for humanity. And even though it's not easy, and we do eat a lot of chocolate in the meanwhile, while going through those experiences, those students emerge as better humans. And I hope I'll be able to do this program till my last year here at Notre Dame, which I hope is not soon. Because this is my passion, even though it hurts. But this is what makes students moral people, ethically grounded people that are going to teach their children and make correct decisions when they are a policymaker or just as an everyday person, not to hate others. I think we would have a much happier world if we just follow basic rules. Let's be tolerant. Let's be loving. John Paul II also said that peace is the dream of every generation. Wouldn't it be nice if it wouldn't be a dream, if it was a reality? Thank you.
I was just going to say I have a personal window into Amelia's trip. My younger daughter, Zoe, who's class of 2021, went on, I think, was it the first year you did that?
I think second.
Your second year. Really was a really important and memorable part of her education here. So just not that you need additional validation of Amelia's great work. What we try to do at NDISC is bridge 2 gaps for Notre Dame students. One of the gaps is, despite the fact that Notre Dame is probably one of the most military-friendly and military-engaged campuses in the United States, we're still basically reflective among our faculty, students, and staff of the more general fact that in modern America, most Americans don't have the sort of direct experience with the military that previous generations had. Now, that, despite the fact that a lot of Notre Dame undergraduates, in fact, want to pursue careers in national security as civilians, in the intelligence community, working in the office of the Secretary of Defense, and in the White House or on congressional staff. So a big challenge is how you prepare people to interface with the uniformed military who wouldn't have had the sort of direct experience with the military that previous generations would have. And part of that you can do in the classroom, teaching courses like U.S. national security policy making or courses in military history and things like that. And that's an important foundation in building career relevant knowledge, but it's not sufficient. And so a couple of other things that we try to do in NDIS to build that complete background that students need to pursue those careers is, one, bring in current and former national security policymakers for students to have the opportunity to meet and interact with. So last time I was here in the Leighton Performing, or the Leighton Theater at the DeBartolo Performing Arts Center, we hosted a visit from President Biden's Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and she was up on the stage with another Notre Dame alum, Amy McAleer, who's a senior official at the Central Intelligence Agency. And so having the opportunity to expose our students to people who are literally in the trenches of the careers that they're going to pursue, I think is a big part of the formation of the whole undergraduate. Second thing that we try to do is experiential learning. So Amelia mentioned the trip to Poland and the Holocaust piece of it. And we do similar sorts of things. So, for example, we've taken groups of students to the Department of Energy nuclear weapons labs at Sandia and Los Alamos. We've taken students to the Marine Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms. We actually, last of our experiential learning trips was over fall break, and former Secretary of the Navy and Senator Jim Webb, and also, I guess, Democratic presidential aspirant, is a distinguished fellow at NDISC. And he put together a course that we did for 8 weeks before we left for 9 days in Vietnam called Webb's War. And we covered a variety of different things, but one of the high points was to have the opportunity to walk the battlefields that he fought on as a Marine platoon and company commander during the Vietnam War, and sort of see through the eyes of somebody who was there in one of the most divisive wars, at least until recently in American history, what they were going through. And, I don't think you can ever fully expose students to the reality of war and combat, but I think interacting with people who've been there and done that is a big part of their sort of extracurricular education and national security affairs. And so thinking, as Amelia has put it, about educating the whole student is a big part of the Notre Dame experience, and one that I'm privileged to be a part of.
Well, and I can see why both of your students all the students have been so inspired, and you can see really where their career paths are taking them. I know personally, Mike, I've had the opportunity to work with you. Mike is also one of the sponsors of the Notre Dame chapter of Women in International Security, which really helps expose the range of pathways that particularly women students can serve to illuminate those paths that aren't always in uniform, that's different ways through the government and also in non-government means. But Mike has been really a champion for women students, and personally that has meant a lot to me.
Well, and it's a privilege, but it's also intimidating because the generation of women that are involved with WISE and going on to follow in your footsteps and Rachel McCaffrey's footsteps, they're pretty impressive. And I'm glad I wasn't, or I'm not a young man having to compete with them. So got big pumps to fill.
So I want to ask Mark, you mentioned that your study abroad programs at Notre Dame really were foundational. We had a great conversation last night kind of exploring that. I wonder if you can share a little bit more with the audience today, speaking to the student piece of the impact of these experiential learning.
Well, I think for me it was the experience itself. I mean, I mentioned being in France was an eye-opening experience, and then going to Jerusalem expecting a situation similar to France and not getting it. It was quite different, but in a good way. Being challenged regularly about U.S. policy was something that really was eye-opening in terms of as an individual and as a student. But part of being in that program is, and I mentioned ecumenical studies, we had Holy Week in Jerusalem, which is a really interesting place to be for Holy Week, but to go to religious ceremonies day after day after day. As a student, it was, initially we thought it might have been tedious, but after the fact, we realized how unique each one of these ceremonies was, being able to understand that a Copt is different from a Christian in a certain way, and that's different from a Southern Baptist that I might run into in Texas. That it is the chance to really get to know the people, to really get to know the programs that makes a difference. And as an individual, it's something that I think ideally we can aspire to as a visitor or as an American going overseas. But the program and the university provides some structure to do that. There may be a language component for us to be able to interact locally with people. There's a ethical and religious component for us to connect and understand what we mentioned before about service and duty. But there's also that personal experience that one gets, that it's just, there's no substitute for that at all, in my opinion.
Completely agree. And that's a great transition now as we explore Catholic teaching in practice and in action, looking where peacekeeping and peacebuilding is at work in pre-conflict, conflict, and also post-conflict areas. According to the United Nations, globally, conflict and violence are on the rise, with the UN warning that peace is more under threat today around the world than it has been since World War II. 2 billion people, a quarter of the entire global population, live in conflict-affected areas. Last year, 84 million people were forcibly displaced because of conflict, violence, and human rights violations. And this year, an estimated 274 million people will need humanitarian assistance due to conflict. Mark, as a foreign service officer and diplomat, you're in this every day. The State Department's all over the world, in country capitals, out in the heartlands, and many times in conflict-affected and dangerous posts. Can you help us identify some of the key drivers of modern-day conflict, as well as talk about some of the tools the State Department uses to resolve these conflicts?
Yeah, I mean, this could be an entire course, so I'll try and keep it short. But in thinking about this, just a quick plug for the Association for Diplomatic Studies and Training, adst.org, is a wonderful resource that has firsthand accounts of diplomats who've really been there and seen the policy and the history made. There's a number of factors that looking through oral histories, looking through the different experiences that seem to stand out. 5. One would be unresolved regional tensions. And that, I think, primarily we're seeing today with violations of territorial integrity, as we see in Ukraine. That is definitely a big driver. Secondly, when there's a breakdown in the rule of law in a nation, that is an invitation for conflict, unfortunately. When there's absent or co-opted state institutions, also has been examples of leading to conflict. The other two were illicit economic gain. And here I think of the example of Colombia, where narcotics, the drug trafficking, led some to become very wealthy. It was illicit, and there's struggles for power. And in that case, that's certainly one of the factors. And then one that's important that we haven't really touched on a lot yet is the very basic scarcity wars that exist, whether it's for natural resources, whether it's due to climate change. There's a lot of potential there around the world for conflict. So as a diplomat, I'll speak to two things. One, officially, the US government and the State Department do have measures in place for addressing each one of these. In some places, we have special envoys. They're presidential appointees or Secretary of State appointed high-level officials that go and work from a place of authority to try and mediate and to help resolve conflict. Within the Department of State itself, there are 2 bureaus that are specifically designated. One of them is relatively new. It's termed CSO, that's the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. They provide assistance to peacekeeping. They send people out. They have a number of advisors. And they also use analytical tools to look and to see if we can analyze why these conflicts are taking place, in what way we can better understand them. There's also, for example, the Bureau of, we call it INL, that's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. And in terms of dealing with existing conflict, INL is endowed with a budget that can help work with local law enforcement sometimes, whether it's narcotics, whether it's helping to develop the state in certain areas. We've seen that as well. And in addition to that, we recently at the State Department talked about diplomacy and development. And that I'll reference USAID, the assistance programs that we have do go out and they're long-term focused programs that help out. And then lastly is what we term public diplomacy. And this is sort of on the front end. Public diplomacy programs are like education programs, arts, culture, mutual understanding, international visitors. There's a whole array of different programs that exist to try and help us meet our interlocutors where they are and to better understand. And so those are just a number of different ways that the department has set out. Something else that I would add, though, within the Catholic lens is perhaps there hasn't been enough conversation about the role of the laity, and that is all of us, as whether we're Catholic or not, as individuals to be peacemakers. I often, in thinking about the topic, I had thought of the Beatitudes, which, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons and daughters of God. That isn't necessarily specific to policymakers. It doesn't say blessed are the elected officials. It's blessed are the peacemakers. So in a way, it's something that can relate to all of us in how we do our work.
That was wonderful, Mark, and it really brought to home the strong nexus between Notre Dame and this topic. Many of the examples that Mark cited from USAID and also State Department with the CSO team, for example, strong ties with our Pulte Institute and also our Kroc Institute, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs. The Kroc team, through CSO collaboration, actually helps serve as the third-party monitor for the peace accords implementation in Colombia, which is just a fantastic example of, again, the nexus of these topics. So thank you, Mark, for going through that. And Ken, you have worn the uniform of the United States as an Army officer for more than 20 years. As I think of the many images of American soldiers, of course, see the armed combatant in snippets of intense combat, but I've also seen our servicemen and women providing food, water, shelter to victims of catastrophe, building schools and providing medical care to those in need. U.S. military is called upon to really do so much in partnership with your colleagues at the State Department as well. It really is a team effort. Can you talk with us about the influences you've seen of the Catholic approach to peacemaking, and are we aligning our military to meet these approaches?
Thanks, Laura. I guess I would share what I hope is a message of hope from my perspective as someone who wore the uniform for a long time, and that is, unfortunately, think about just war theory and the principle of the last resort. Sometimes conflict and combat are necessary, and so when you're in that environment, that is undoubtedly a life-changing experience for those that are involved in it and for those that surround it. It takes an immense amount of courage, grit, determination, trust, love for your fellow service member to get through that moment of intense combat, intense conflict. So my hope is perhaps on the other side of that, that there's an opportunity when you get through that period of time, and I've seen this, and the spans of time vary, but when you get through that period of time, and perhaps you're on the other side of this intense time of conflict and combat, there's an opportunity to engage in and be a part of a rebirth, a renewal of a community that has been broken by conflict and by combat. And that takes a different set of perspectives and a different set of attributes. Surely grit and determination are involved there, but an immense amount of trust and empathy and understanding and patience and humility, combined with some really important things that our students are learning here, like how to be a critical thinker, how to solve problems, how to be innovative, how to be entrepreneurial, as you think about being a part of a renewal or a rebirth or a regrowth of a community that's been torn apart by conflict and combat. And I've seen this. My two bookend deployments to Iraq. One was in 2003, so the whole first year of combat operations in Iraq was an entirely and vastly different experience than my second tour in Iraq, which was in 2010, which was the withdrawal of combat forces from the country. And to see the way that the land and the communities and the towns and the people of that country had transformed over that 7-year span was moving to me and provided this kind of message of hope. So that's kind of my thought.
Thank you, Kevin. A devastating conflict that is top of mind for all of us is the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. We seem to be at a tragic impasse. Amelia, love to hear from you, your thoughts. Is there hope of resolving this conflict in a peaceful way? And also, if you could maybe elaborate, what are the obstacles to peace as well?
So obviously this conflict is very personal to me because my parents live in Poland. And right now, my 10-year-old daughter is studying in Polish primary school for a couple of months. So I always ponder upon the possibilities of peace. First, I think what we need to remember is that we should never give up hope. Because without hope, we would be just sad creations of God. But then, when we think at the reality of the conflict, the prospect of a negotiated solution very soon are, in my opinion, unfortunately dim. Why? Number one is a conflict over territorial sovereignty. It's a war where one state attacked another state and took a chunk out while thinking that those chunks belong to it. Therefore, we know from the scholarship and the practice of territorial conflicts that they are the most dangerous, the longest, drawn out. They cause a lot of hurt, physical, mental. And why is it? There is no free territory around the world. It's been all taken. And I think to bring it home, let's imagine that some other country took a piece of United States and claimed that it's theirs. How do we feel as humans about that? So territory brings a lot of emotions with it, not only material resources and so forth, but also just human feeling of belonging. This is why this conflict is particularly dangerous and difficult to solve. Now, what are we facing here? We have Russia, where propaganda plays an enormous role in shaping what the population thinks. And I watch television on YouTube from Russia, and because I grew up in a communist Poland, I understand Russian, so I know what's going on. I mean, it's unbelievable. There is also a generational gap where younger people are leaving Russia. I recently returned from United Arab Emirates, and I went for breakfast in hotel. 50% of people spoke Russian. And they were all buff men that worked out in the gym with me. Okay? So the population is leaving. Putin is, of course, in a very hard situation because there are losses, embarrassment. What do we have in Ukraine? We have really an amazing resolve to fight. And I think that was underestimated by Putin and perhaps the world. The conflict, I think, is going to be dragging on for a while, and I don't really like to talk about it. Why? Because I see children. I see women, I see men, I see humans hurting. And everything that comes out of our mouth as far as opinions has an impact. This is why we have to be so careful even speaking about that. You know, I visit Poland very often, and my students are going to see it in 3 days. Out of 40 million population in Poland, over the span of the war, there were 10 million Ukrainians, one way or another, on the territory of the country. So you hear the Ukrainian language. It is different to ponder upon the importance of peaceful resolution after seeing the reality of it, than reading it and kind of, thinking about it hypothetically. Again, the role of empathy. So what is the prospects of peace? But what peace? Again, I want to think about what John Paul II said. He says, noble diplomacy, honest dialogue, not making solutions that are haphazard, that set a precedent for a very dangerous future for the world. So we always have to have hope, but we have to be careful. Now, of course, international law is idealistic in a way. And power politics sometimes demands solutions that are suboptimal. But it is really important to balance. What was really difficult for me is that when Pope Francis had a conversation with Kirill, so the leader of the faithful people in Russia. And the conversation lasted 40 minutes over Zoom. And for 20 minutes, Kirill was reading the justifications for war. The role of belief in God, is there not to matter at all? So I'm going to end on this sad note. But let's hope. Let's hope. Thank you.
Thank you. And there certainly is a common theme of hope and empathy. And Mike, we'll turn it to you. I know this is an area that you've given a lot of thought to as well. So can you share your thoughts about the pathways to peace in Ukraine, and also if Catholic teaching can help guide us in our approaches in any way?
Well, the current pontiff, Pope Francis, has taken a position that has earned him quite a bit of criticism. He has been reluctant to take a side in the current fight between Ukraine and Russia, and he's taken a position rather in favor of peace and a negotiated peace. And for a lot of people, I think this is a little bit discordant. After all, as Amelia pointed out, this is a territorial fight that, at least in our consciousness, really became clear in February of 2022, and it seems black and white, open and shut. Putin invaded the Ukraine for, clearly illegitimate reasons. Why isn't the Holy Father calling him out on this? For some people, it sort of reminds them of the debate about Pope Pius XII during the Second World War, and why he didn't speak out, in many people's view, more clearly about what the Nazis were doing, particularly, but not exclusively, to the Jews in the territory that they occupied. I don't want to get into a whole discussion about Pius XII. I think it's a bit of a caricature to say that he was Hitler's pope. But I do want to say a little bit about Pope Francis. And I actually think that the position that Pope Francis is taking is both morally justified and pragmatically sound. It's morally justified, it seems to me, because the situation between Russia and Ukraine is not black and white. It's actually very gray. The war has roots that go much deeper than February of 2022, or even 2014 with the Russian seizure of Crimea. And I don't think we can understand what's going on between Russia and Ukraine without also understanding Western policy, and particularly the expansion of NATO, which has really been going on since the mid-1990s, if not earlier. Okay, so there are two sides, and while the moral balance may still favor one side, it's not 99-1. It's closer to being more even in my judgment. But pragmatically, the situation in Ukraine is not going to be solved on the battlefield. We're all waiting for an imminent Ukrainian counteroffensive. I don't want to make bold predictions that may be wrong, but if my wife would give me $100, I would bet that after the Ukrainian offensive this summer, the situation is going to look very much as it does now, with Russia still occupying a big chunk of Ukrainian territory. And if that's right, then we have to ask ourselves, how much longer are we going to support a war that ultimately is not going to produce much of a change in the status quo? Indeed, one of the most important but least discussed aspects of just war theory is whether the use of military force has a reasonable prospect of success. And I thought a lot about this over the course of the last 6 or 8 months during the battle for the Donbas city of Bakhmut, or Artemovsk. And it seems to me that what came out of that was that the Russian offensive made very minimal gains at a huge human cost. And I fear that the same thing is going to be true with the Ukrainian offensive. And if that's the case, then the time, despite neither side being enthusiastic about it, for a negotiated settlement is more pressing now than it seems to me than it's been any other time. And the Holy Father, in my judgment, is taking the right view in pushing for that. Now is the time.
Thank you, and I hope our audience members, when we open it up to Q&A here, I think both you, Mike, and Amelia, I think you've given a lot of material for follow-up questions, so I hope folks are getting their questions in mind. But before we wrap up this portion of the panel, I wanted to have us focus on any collective calls to action, examining the whole of society teamwork that is really required to overcome conflict in all corners of the world. So my final question to all of you, peace starts at home. Our current society has many conflicts in it, political tensions and raw emotional divides. So how can our audience today apply the tenets we've been talking about this morning of Catholic peacebuilding and apply them in their daily lives? Mark, maybe we'll start with you.
So Dr. Richard Hawkins talks about the difference between power versus force. And just to follow up on the idea of Ukraine is there's force going in and with the baton and just submitting someone to one's will. Or there's taking a powerful approach. And the power approach comes from a place of authority, comes from a place of credibility. And that could be the way for a long-term solution. That's on a global scale. On an individual scale, the call to action is to, again, I recall as a youth going to a youth mass, and at the end of the mass, instead of saying the mass has ended, they say, our mass never ends. It must be lived. So go out and serve. And this, in a way, is a call individually for us to be peacemakers, as you mentioned, in the home. It's about, for me, a good husband, a good parent, a good colleague, and then within our professional and civic engagements, to always remember that we respect each other's dignity, respect our humanity. It's simple. It's the different religions talk about a version of the golden rule. And I say it to my son, but it's in a way, it's the same with Rotary, it's the same with other. If one kind of abides by that, that's a way that it's a good moral compass for our interactions. Yeah.
Any of our other panelists want to offer any final thoughts?
I would just say, historically in the United States, Catholics have been the swing voters in the sense that they've gone back and forth between both political parties. And in a way, a strong political center is absolutely essential to the healthy functioning of democracy. And what's made our democracy so problematic in recent years is its polarization and its sort of freezing between two irreconcilable extremes. And so there's something about Catholic political engagement that leads to moderation and flexibility. And I think that that's what we bring to American democracy. And I hope we'll continue to be the swing voters, the sort of pivot in American politics, sort of the balance on the scale moving forward, because that's what we need, in my judgment, today.
Thank you, Mike. So I want to open it up to any questions from our audience. There are some microphones down here in the corner. So I'll give a second if anyone has any questions for our panelists. There we go. Sir, why don't you start?
I'm old and I can't remember names, but Professor, could you develop a little bit more of the historical or political reasons for why Ukraine deserves more responsibility for the conflict than would be popularly believed?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. And, again, I could go on for 2 hours about it. I wouldn't say Ukraine necessarily has a lot of responsibility for the current situation, although I think they have some. I'm sort of somebody who thinks that John Mearsheimer, famous professor at the University of Chicago and a good friend of mine, has laid out a very powerful case that in fact the West, and especially the United States, has played a big and unfortunately negative role in affecting Russian Western relations in a very negative way. And I think this really goes back to decisions that we made in the 1990s about NATO expansion. And here I think I would, not that I ever disagree with my colleague Amelia on these things, but I spent a lot of time in Russia in the 1990s. And the Russians I knew were basically Western-oriented liberals, the sort of people who had been around Mikhail Gorbachev in the 1980s. In the context of the debate about whether NATO should expand or not, there was universal consensus among Russians that this would be a bad thing, particularly if NATO expanded and excluded Russian membership, which people think is crazy. They don't remember that, in fact, this was one option that was on the table in the 1990s. But I remember being in a meeting with Andrei Kozyrev, who was Yeltsin's foreign minister in 1995. Kozyrev, who's now in exile in Florida and is no supporter of Putin and no supporter of the war, nonetheless was telling everybody that was coming through Moscow and they thought had connections with the Clinton administration that if we're interested in the future of democracy in Russia, the last thing we will do will be to push NATO expansion. Now, the Clinton administration, despite hearing this from a lot of people of goodwill, in Russia and elsewhere in Europe, went ahead with a series of expansions of NATO. The first in 1999 that included Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. Now, what else happened in pop quiz? What else happened in Moscow in 1999? First time a little-known political operative from St. Petersburg came on the Russian political scene. And of course, that was Vladimir Putin. And it seems to me that if you look back over the course of subsequent waves of NATO expansion, that the worsening of relations between Russia and the West neatly tracks with each of those decisions. Now, what about Ukraine? George Kennan, the architect of the American Cold War foreign policy of containment, wrote a letter to the Clinton administration in the context of the debate about the first round of NATO expansion. And he said, this is a bad idea, but the worst thing would be to include include Ukraine in NATO, that this is the ultimate red line. Now, Kennan's private letter to Clinton was just made public by a historian and biographer of George Kennan, Frank Castiglione. It was published in Foreign Affairs a couple of issues ago. Very prescient warning that by expanding NATO, and particularly talking about expanding NATO to include Ukraine, that we were risking the sort of conflict that in fact we have. So, Ukraine has made some mistakes. Biggest mistake they made after electing in 2019 Volodymyr Zelensky in part on a platform of re-engaging with the Minsk Accords process is to back away from a negotiated settlement, which would have admittedly forced them to some painful concessions, but concessions that would be a lot less painful than the war that we've seen there since 2022. So I think that's what Paul Harvey, my favorite radio commentator, and somebody who, at least for the older folks in the audience, he always used to say, what's the rest of the story? And that's the rest of the story, in my view, of the Ukraine war.
Thank you. Let's take a question from this side, sir.
Yes, so first of all, to all the panelists, thank you for really being peacemakers. Thanks. I mean, from all your comments, you live thoughtful, conscious, and peacemaking lives, and that was just nice to hear in all of your comments. So my question, first little context, Pope Paul VI said, if you want peace, work for justice. President Eisenhower, in leaving office, said the greatest threat to our democratic republic is the industrial military complex. So President Biden recently proposed an $886 billion defense budget as the largest budget in the history of our country in real dollars. Conservative hawks in the Congress quickly jumped on that and saying that's way inefficient or insufficient. So my question, and I'll direct it to Ken first, and any of the panelists can comment after that, is what can we do to trim the defense budget? Because right now, that $886 billion is more than the 10 other countries in the world together, and 8 of those countries are our allies. So it seems to me we have to begin to address that if we want to really move forward in peace. So.
Thank you for the question. I'm frankly not sure that I'm qualified to answer how we would go about cutting the defense budget. I don't know. I mean, Laura, I know you're not fielding questions of the 4 of us, but I don't know from your perspective in your federal relations position, whether you and your experience, you have much closer experience to the budget process than I do. I hate to pitch one back to you, but I wonder if you have some thoughts on that.
Sure, I'll share just some thoughts on it for context. I think that is a key question that needs to be solved. And one of the things Mark and I actually were talking about that last night. One of the unique aspects when you look at those numbers, though, a huge portion of those dollars go to our personnel. It's the human element of our military. And you look at the support tail and the retirement and then taking care of our wounded service members, a lot of that also goes to that big number. Now, with that said, I've spent a lot of time in uniform and in the building. There's also, we are a ginormous bureaucracy. And I think what we'll start to see is you can do more AI technologies. We can perhaps shrink that big footprint of the person cost. But I think, you talk to most folks in the military, they're going to be your biggest proponents of wanting a larger State Department too. I think they see the needs for having your diplomats.
Yeah, I mean, if I could jump in, it's a good question, and it also begs the question about what are our priorities as well. I mean, it's accurate that the next 10 countries combined don't spend as much as we do. So there's a question of, there's fiscal policy that can go into trimming here and there. But I just wanted to make one quick plug. Your tax dollars going towards foreign affairs and going towards diplomacy account for less than 1/2 of 1% of all of our budget. Our entire diplomatic service, in other words, if we were to line up all career foreign service officers and ambassadors, and they'd fit on one aircraft carrier. There are more members of the military band than there are diplomats all over the world. So we're represented in 192 countries in some of the more dangerous areas doing this kind of work. So what are the priorities? On the one hand, I'll just say I think we're all getting a steal in terms of not much of a budget for foreign affairs. But I could maybe point to the example of Costa Rica. Costa Rica is a country that's not in conflict, but the relative percentage of what they spend on their budget goes towards education. The UN has a school there in San Jose, I believe, that is meant to form the next generation of UN cadre and other diplomats. So it's a good question. It's a difficult policy question, of course, but it may also require a little bit of thinking about how we can reprioritize ourselves. Thanks.
And we have time for one more. I can't believe we've gone through time so fast. One more audience question, so I'll take it over to this side. And we'll be out front if other folks want to ask questions afterwards.
You know, I think that this question is a great way to end your wonderful seminar. And everybody's been talking about the present. And I have grandchildren, they're very high tech. And I'm worried about critical thinking, artificial intelligence in the future of peacemaking and war. And I'd like you to comment on that.
You want to take it, Mike?
Well, artificial intelligence is, along with the trajectory of the global climate, one of the two big potential existential threats that we face in the future. There are two elements that make thinking about the nature of these threats challenging, but nonetheless imperative. One is there's sort of less scientific uncertainty at this point about what the effects are of continued human intervention in the environment on what the environment's going to look like in even 25 years from now. But there's still a lot of uncertainty about the best ways to deal with it. We're just sort of at the dawn of thinking about artificial intelligence and where it's going and what it's going to look like in roughly the same time period. And what makes AI so complicated is there are actually two elements of it. There's the whole question of what will be the nature of the intelligence that can be artificially generated, within 20 years. We don't know, but we have some sense that it's going to be much different than what it is today. And so that makes understanding the nature of both the opportunities and the threats it presents very, very difficult. But there's also then the question of it's not just AI as a potential actor that we have to think about, but also the various countries around the world that are developing artificial intelligence for economic and national security reasons. So we could be, we already are, in my judgment, entering into an arms race about a technology that we don't fully understand what it's going to represent in 20 years, but doing so within the context of traditional great power rivalry. And that's a very complicated situation, and one that will require your grandchildren to be very, very thoughtful on these issues in a way that I think previous generations have not been. So I hope they're coming to Notre Dame, because Notre Dame is the sort of place that can prepare people to think about those sort of complicated, wicked problems.
Well, and I think this conversation clearly could go on for much longer. I encourage, and I hope many of you will continue these conversations throughout reunion and take them home with you. When we go back to our communities, let us together create and foster a sense of human solidarity and concern for the common good, where we work together to heal, unify, and enlighten our fellow brothers and sisters in the hope that we can extend the university's reach as a force for good. And with that, I thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you to each of our panelists for sharing their insights with us. In a moment, before folks leave, you'll have an opportunity to scan a QR code here to give a survey about today's program. We really appreciate your feedback. And before we go, we'd like to have you listen to the inspiring words of former President of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, who recently delivered the commencement address to our graduates on May 21st, and who challenges each of us to be peacekeepers in our own lives.
Dear Reverend Jenkins and members of the Board of Trustees, distinguished members of the faculty, honored alumni, students, your well-known Kroc Institute for International Peace, whose head is my compatriot Josefina Echavarria, has been and continues to be a fundamental ally in the process of not only making peace, but also building peace in my country, Colombia. No matter where you are, what you are working on, be peacemakers. Whatever it takes, at all times, for the sake of this world, become peacemakers. You must be at peace with yourself, at peace with your own conscience. Choose the way of peace.